The courtroom was never meant to sound like this. Silence, thick, electric, more deafening than any gavel strike, hung in the air after Jasmine Crockett's last words tore through the chamber. What moments earlier had been a cauldron of interruptions, chuckles, and dismissive barbs was now suspended in stillness. Every eye was on her, every mouth clamped shut in a mix of shock and disbelief. She did not raise her voice. She did not pound the lectern. But the way her final sentence landed made the room collapse into reverence. The air itself seemed to lock in place, as though even the walls understood they had just witnessed something that could not be undone. And at the center of it all sat Judge Richard Leon, a man known for discipline, stoicism, and careful impartiality. He had built his reputation on detachment. He was the arbiter who rarely blinked, who never so much as tilted his head when lawyers shouted or witnesses wept. He projected an almost marble-like neutrality, and yet in this charged moment, even he could not remain stone. Slowly, he leaned forward, the kind of movement so rare for him it drew an almost audible gasp from the audience. His hand pressed against the bench, his face angled toward Crockett. What followed was not a flamboyant speech, not some break-in protocol. It was something quieter, weightier. His eyes did not merely recognize her, they affirmed her. His voice, low but firm, cut through the stunned quiet. "Representative Crockett," he said, "that was extraordinary." The words echoed across the chamber like an unanticipated verdict. Jurors shifted in their seats. Antagonists who had worn smirks now froze, trapped beneath the gravity of a judge who very rarely gave praise, much less to a figure they had targeted with scorn. The audience seemed to inhale all at once, as if the courtroom had wordlessly agreed. They had just witnessed history. Jasmine Crockett stood unmoved, her composure intact, though inside the magnitude of the moment loomed. Respect, not demanded, but earned, had been spoken from the most unlikely of places. Before the room fell into stunned silence, it burned with hostility. This was no ordinary session. It was a hearing staged for spectacle, with cameras rolling, headlines waiting to be written, and reputations to be made or unmade. Jasmine Crockett wasn't merely testifying, she was being tested. Her opponents had come prepared, not with good faith questions, but with sharpened daggers slid into the velvet sheath of procedure. From the moment she sat down, the disdain was tangible. Scripts had been prepared, smiles rehearsed. Every antagonist wore that same smug expression, the look of politicians who believed they already knew how this would end. Their story of her was pre-written. Young, impulsive, unseasoned, more passion than reason. They came ready to roll the cameras on her frustration, eager to catch one slip of anger they could broadcast as proof that she didn't belong. The bait began immediately. "Representative," one drawled, "perhaps you think you understand? The statute's here, but the gravity may be beyond your current experience." The words dripped with condescension, couched as explanation but cutting like insult. Another leaned in with theatrical concern. "Are you here to debate law or to deliver campaign speeches? It's hard to tell." The line drew a chorus of chuckles from their side of the chamber, laughter echoing loud enough to reach the press pens in the back. They interrupted her mid-sentence, pretended not to hear her answers, and spoke over her when she requested clarification. Barbs were tossed one on top of the other like stones hurled at glass, meant to chip away her composure. They pushed harder, circling like predators sensing the moment their prey would falter. Viewers at home watching the live stream felt their stomachs twist. They could see what was happening, could read the energy as plain as day. This was not questioning. This was cornering. But what raised the stakes beyond the personal was what Crockett represented in that room. For black women in politics, the gauntlet is always doubly treacherous. Speak too firmly and you are dismissed as angry. Speak too quietly and you are dismissed as weak. The range of acceptable humanity is squeezed so tightly, it becomes a caricature her opponents were counting on her to fit. Those smirks weren't just arrogance. They were the smugness of men certain that stereotypes would do the work for them. And for Crockett, the burden was immense. She understood their strategy. She had seen it play out countless times before. The ambushes, the interruptions, the attempts to provoke emotion until the clip could be weaponized online. This wasn't just about her legal defense. It was a referendum on her credibility itself, her dignity on trial alongside the facts. The wider the audience, the heavier the weight. Millions were watching, streaming live from classrooms, living rooms, and transit stations across the country. For her supporters, the question wasn't whether she was just answering, it was whether she could endure the fire without being consumed. For her detractors, every second was a bet against her composure. And somewhere in between sat Judge Richard Leon, the arbiter cloaked in stone-faced neutrality, watching as the drama unfolded. The danger was real, because this entire arena was designed to break her. They weren't simply attacking her answers. They were attacking her right to have those answers taken seriously. The stakes weren't whether she won a point. The stakes were whether she left the room intact or labeled forever by the caricature they wished to paint. Yet as their interruptions grew louder, as the laughter rolled across the chamber, Crockett sat taller, eyes steady, waiting for her turn. She did not flinch, did not smirk, did not return their poison in kind. She was biding. She was calculating. Viewers who knew her recognized it immediately. This was the calm before the reckoning. They thought she'd fold under the trap, but they had no idea what they were up against. But to understand how a single statement could stun even the judge, we must rewind to the fire that lit the match. To truly feel the gravity of what Jasmine Crockett overcame that day, we must understand the nature of those seated across from her. These were not just lawyers and lawmakers performing their duty. They were practiced cynics, experts in the weaponization of disdain. Their arsenal wasn't built on evidence or principle. It was built on eye rolls, smirks, and the repeated use of volume to overwhelm truth. For years, these figures had polished the same act. They thrived not on substance, but on derision. Every committee, every hearing, every televised spat became fodder for them to perform contempt for the cameras and then cut the performance into sound bites for their base. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in the clip, the viral moment, the headline that would be repeated across their preferred platforms. Their reputations weren't earned through legislation but through the sly raising of an eyebrow, through the mocking chuckle into a live microphone, through the satisfaction of reducing their opponents into caricatures to score quick digital applause. And because cruelty was their brand, they wore it like a uniform. Picture it with clarity. The way one leaned back in his chair with arms folded, grins stretched smugly across his face each time Crockett opened her mouth. Another tapped a pen noisily against his notepad, exaggerating his irritation while muttering sotto voce to colleagues, knowing microphones just barely caught it. Yet another made grand displays of shuffling papers or scoffing audibly, punctuating her sentences with his chosen soundtrack of disdain. Their tactic was simple: overwhelm, through mockery. If Crockett answered forcefully, they would raise an eyebrow and smirk, branding her as angry. If she answered calmly, they would cut her off with a laugh, branding her as weak. It was a trap designed to collapse no matter which doorway she stepped through, and the audience wasn't meant to miss the performance either. Every roll of the eyes, every theatrical chuckle was pitched at the cameras. They knew their base back home would watch through clipped highlights, proud to see their representatives putting her in her place. It was cynicism as theater, perfectly scripted, perfectly rehearsed. They walked into that chamber with one goal: to turn dignity into a debacle. This was not new for them. These were the same figures who had disrupted other hearings, who had derailed previous testimonies with antics, stunts, and commentary aimed more at raising their profile than raising the level of public discourse. One had famously stormed out of a prior proceeding in mock protest, earning glowing commentary from partisan outlets. Another had built a digital following on the strength of sarcastic one-liners delivered during serious inquiries, to wild applause from people watching not for solutions, but for outrage. They were masters of noise, and noise was precisely what they wielded that day against Crockett. Their laughter wasn't humor, it was a blade. Their interruptions weren't clumsy, they were deliberate traps. Every time she opened her mouth, the cynics answered not with debate, but with derision. They didn't want dialogue, they wanted dominance. What made their behavior more sinister was the coded nature of it. They deployed every trope in the handbook of systemic dismissal, but cloaked it under professional veneers, calling her passionate instead of credible, suggesting she calm down when she wasn't raising her voice, expressing concern about her tone instead of answering her arguments. And for every viewer who had lived through those same invisible slights at workplaces, schools, or family tables, it was painfully familiar. This was why the stakes of the moment felt so high. Crockett wasn't just answering questions. She was walking into the buzzsaw of a machine designed to grind her dignity into dust. She was being squeezed through a mold countless others had been forced into, told to shrink or to combust. And what made the antagonists so smug was they'd seen the strategy work before. Plenty had taken the bait, raised their voice in exhaustion, only to be immortalized as memes stripped of context. It was the mockery machine, churning ridicule into fuel for power. But arrogance has a blind spot, so enamored with their own cleverness, so convinced Crockett would play the role they'd written, they missed the resilience building inside her silence. They saw a target, not a strategist. They saw vulnerability where there was actually preparation. And as they sat back in their chairs, chuckling, rolling their eyes, congratulating themselves mid-hearing that the narrative was set, something else was aligning against them, something stronger than their stagecraft. Because while they wielded mockery, Crockett wielded composure. And when those two forces finally collided, no smirk or eye roll could withstand it. But this machine of mockery would soon backfire when faced with composure that refused to break. Long before the brutal quiet of that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett had already been forged in fire. Her ascent was not the tale of someone groomed by old money or cushioned by influential mentors in the halls of Washington. Hers was a climb uphill against gravity, where each step sharpened her resolve and deepened her sense of duty to those the system overlooked. Crockett's origin story begins in Texas, not in marble-lined chambers, but in courtrooms where her voice became a lifeline for people who had nothing else. As a civil rights attorney, she didn't chase prestige cases with headlines guaranteed. Instead, she sought out the fights no one else wanted. She stood for eviction victims clinging to their homes, teenagers swallowed by a criminal justice system that branded them unworthy before they turned 20, and working families who had only ever known what it felt like to stand on the margins. When she walked into those spaces, she didn't wear the armor of wealth or pedigree. She carried something more indestructible, lived experience. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, to have assumptions whispered before she even spoke, to be told by body language alone, "You do not belong here." Yet each time she embraced the fire, letting it temper her into something stronger. Opposing lawyers rolled their eyes at her youth. Judges sometimes spoke to her like a student rather than a peer, but she never folded. She studied harder, argued sharper, and with each dismissal flung her way, she built herself a new layer of resilience. The courtroom, in many ways, was her crucible, teaching her both the tactical brilliance of law and the deeper lesson of endurance. When mockery arrived from the other side of the bench, as it often did, she learned to let composure be her shield and facts be her sword. The more they doubted her, the fiercer her discipline became. She discovered the most devastating rebuttal was not anger but clarity, the refusal to play the part her opponents had cast for her. Her reputation grew quietly but forcefully. People began whispering about the young lawyer who broke complex cases down into plain truths that juries couldn't ignore. She wasn't flashy, but she cut through spectacle with directness that left adversaries sputtering. Those who had thought they could brush past her soon realized their mistake. Crockett would match them on law, on grit, and on conscience. And that combination could not be undone. This was never just ambition for her. It was a service. She wasn't fighting so she could get a better title or see her name on plaques. She was fighting because she remembered the people who had no one to show up for them. She carried them into every courtroom. She thought of the grandmother who risked losing her home because of predatory practices, of the teenager sitting in holding cells for a mistake far smaller than the punishment. She thought of every young woman of color who had been told they were too much or not enough. And she knew that when she spoke, she carried their voices into rooms that otherwise pretended not to hear them. Her leap into politics was, in truth, a natural extension of that mission. She had argued within the system. Now she would fight to change the system itself. She walked into committee rooms the same way she had walked into courthouses, unapologetic, unyielding, eyes steady. She quickly developed a reputation as not just a vote on progressive issues, but as a force of unvarnished honesty. She could deliver sharp criticism one minute and heartfelt defense of the underdog the next. And through it all, she refused to play by the rules of politeness written to keep people like her sidelined. But with this reputation came scrutiny. That was harsher than what most colleagues faced. The double standards followed her. Speak bluntly, and she was accused of being angry. Show passion, and she was branded unprofessional. Maintain cool composure, and she was called calculating. Each move, each expression was twisted, a reminder that stereotypes were always waiting, eager to box her in. And still, she pressed forward. If anything, those attempts to reduce her only made her determination burn hotter. Her supporters, especially women and people of color, saw in her a mirror of their own battles. Her fight wasn't just symbolic, it was practical proof that their voices, too, deserved space. Every time she refused to buckle, they felt a sliver of catharsis. Every time she held herself steady under fire, they felt represented in places that had too long shut them out. By the time she entered that fateful hearing before Judge Richard Leon, Crockett carried not only her credentials, but also the collective weight of years being underestimated and years refusing to be diminished. She was the sum of shunned cases, long nights in legal briefs, battles against stereotypes sharpened by her refusal to conform. She had mastered the art of letting arrogance exhaust itself while she saved her strikes for the exact moment they would pierce deepest. That is why, even as her opponents chuckled, rolled their eyes, and layered their questions with smirking cruelty, Crockett did not falter. She had been here before, in countless forms, with countless faces. To her, this wasn't new. To her, this wasn't extraordinary. It was déjà vu, and she knew precisely how to play it. She wasn't just another participant. She was a living counterpoint to the entire spectacle. And this time, the stakes would amplify her composure into legend, and soon that fire would collide perfectly with the arrogance arrayed before her. The chamber seemed to thrum with impatience as the questioning raged on. What had begun as structured inquiry had devolved into an orchestrated gauntlet, the antagonists taking turns at the microphone as if performing for an invisible scorekeeper. Each speaker seemed less intent on uncovering truth and more determined to break Jasmine Crockett's rhythm. The interruptions piled higher. Before she could finish, a thought, one voice would slice across her words, dripping condescension cloaked as clarification. Another would laugh lightly in the middle of her response, elbowing a colleague as if to say, "See? She's unraveling." Each dig came not in isolation, but in waves, designed to bury her under the weight of ridicule. "You're mixing passion with fact, Representative," one antagonist sneered, leaning back in his chair with a practiced smirk. "This chamber demands expertise, not emotional rhetoric." His words landed heavy with coded dismissal, the insinuation that her very presence was more theater than talent. The side of the room aligned with her detractors chuckled again, the noise rolling like cheap applause. A younger member, eager to earn points with the veterans of contempt, offered his own barb. "Is this your idea of legal reasoning? Or are we watching campaign rehearsals?" Even staffers on their side grinned, scribbling notes aimed not at advancing the hearing but at constructing viral clips. Yet through it all, Crockett remained composed. She held her pen in her hands, tapping it gently against her binder, her eyes never dropping despite the chorus of dismissals. She absorbed the attacks like a granite wall meeting rain. Each drop cascaded down but left no crack. Her silence, infuriating to those baiting her, grew heavier with each insult. And to the audience watching online, it was plain to see. She wasn't shrinking. She was gathering. The antagonists pressed harder, mistaking her composure for hesitation. "Representative, let me help," one lilted sarcastically. "It seems you're a little lost in the law here." He gestured to the crowd as if sharing a private joke with the entire courtroom. Another rolled his eyes so dramatically it was visible even in the back row. They thought they had won. They thought they had branded her the way they had branded others before, overwhelmed, diminished, broken. But tension does something in silence. It coils, it compresses, it grows unbearable until it explodes. And Crockett's silence was no accident. It was the quiet sharpening of a blade. When her light clicked red at the mic, the chamber shifted. The interruptions died not from courtesy, but from anticipation. Even those who had mocked moments earlier found themselves leaning in unconsciously, bracing for the sound of her voice. And when it came, it was not loud, but it was unyielding. "I've listened," she began, her tone precise as cold steel. "I've heard the smirks, the interruptions, the condescension dressed up as questions. And let me say clearly, none of that disguises the weakness of the arguments you've made here today." It was as if the oxygen snapped from the room. The chuckling ceased. Those who had been scribbling smug notes froze mid-word. Her words flowed with deliberate cadence. Calm, incisive, dripping not with anger but with absolute clarity. With each point, she dismantled their derision, citing case law when they said she was lost, quoting procedure when they accused her of theater, turning each insult into evidence of their own bad faith. Every rebuttal tightened the coil further. "You came here hoping for sound bites," she said, "but sound bites don't survive truth, and truth doesn't fear smirks." The antagonists who had mocked her the loudest now shifted in their seats, shoulders tense, their confidence drained in real time. Crockett's words struck not like a raised fist, but like a well-aimed spear, piercing the arrogance one barb at a time. Viewers online erupted with relief. Comment streams lit up with "Yes, say that." Fire emojis flowing like lava down every feed. It was no longer her own defense. It was the mockery machine itself being exposed, dismantled meticulously in front of millions. And in that chamber, amidst the stunned silence now thick as stone, the sense crystallized. This was no ordinary response. Something had shifted, something irreversible. And while her words carried the weight of fire, the real shock was still to come. But the eruption wasn't only her words, the shock was who reacted to them. The microphone light glowed red. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, and in that moment, the chaotic hum of the hearing collapsed into expectant silence. To her detractors, it may have seemed like hesitation, perhaps even weakness. But Crockett was steadying herself, not for survival, but for the strike. She began deliberately, quiet enough to force the room toward her words rather than away from them. "With all respect," she said, her tone clear and reserved, "if this chamber is truly dedicated to the law, then let us treat the law with the dignity it deserves. No rush, no fury. Calm precision, like a surgeon selecting her first scalpel." Her antagonists smirked. They whispered under their breath, certain that these first words meant she would meander. But Crockett's tempo was intentional. She was laying bricks for a foundation. She summarized the statute at issue, breaking down legal precedent in plain, unflinching language, matching their jabs with sources and citations so bulletproof that the scoffing began to feel absurd. For every accusation she was confused, she responded with chapter and verse of precedent. For every claim that she was grandstanding, she pointed to procedural rules that her opponents themselves had twisted. And then she turned sharper. Her pace picked up, her enunciation cutting clean. She no longer merely referenced statutes, she wielded them. "You've insisted my words lack weight," she continued. "Yet what burdens the credibility of this chamber is not my voice, but your refusal to engage with the facts as they actually stand." Her opponents shifted. One cleared his throat. Another fumbled with his stack of papers as if distance from the table might shield him. They had underestimated her composure, mistaking patience for weakness, silence for surrender. But Crockett was spinning their derision on its head, converting each petty jab into fuel for her argument. The room tightened as witnesses, reporters, and staffers caught the change in energy. The livestream chat surged, viewers sensing the electricity. Her words fused calm restraint with razor edges, and with every phrase her adversaries shrank. Now she pressed harder, turning their tactics against them. "You suggest this is the wrong space for passion. But tell me, what is passion? For the rule of law, if not the highest respect this institution can demand?" Gasps whispered across the benches. She continued, "You mock my credibility. Yet every interruption, every smirk, every dismissal you've launched doesn't diminish me. It diminishes you, because the performance here is not mine, it is yours." The audience reacted viscerally. Heads jerked, eyes locked, notes ceased scribbling. For a brief second, the antagonists looked exposed, like masks knocked from their faces. Silence is rare in hearings like this, but hers was producing exactly that, jaw-dropping stillness. Her rhythm grew into a crescendo. "Courage," she declared, looking directly at the faces of those who had interrupted her, "isn't mocking someone mid-sentence. Courage isn't hiding behind a smirk. Courage is speaking truth when it is unpopular and standing on it even when you stand alone." Those words didn't just hang in the room, they surged. The antagonists who had once laughed outright now sat uneasy, their arrogance betraying itself through nervous shifting. Her defenders, meanwhile, looked visibly revitalized, shoulders pulled straighter, nodding in quiet solidarity. And then came the line that reframed everything, the pivot that made the room hers entirely. With composure sharpened to steel, Crockett concluded, "You didn't invite me here to listen. You invited me here to play a role you had already scripted. But I don't play caricatures. I don't bow to mockery. I stand in this chamber as myself, and that today is more truthful and more lawful than anything you have offered." It landed like thunder. For a moment no one moved. The antagonists' faces, colored with smugness just minutes before, now appeared strained, almost cornered. Their entire performance had collapsed into silence. Allies' mouths tightened into stunned smiles, as if realizing they had just witnessed more than a reply. They had witnessed transformation. And then, when silence had nearly grown unbearable, a sound came from the one place no one expected. Judge Richard Leon. He had watched the entire exchange with his trademark rigor, body still, expression unreadable. But something in that last declaration moved him to action. Slowly, he leaned forward, the bench creaking under his weight. His hand pressed flat atop the desk. For a man known for neutral reserve, the shift was massive. The entire chamber tracked him, breath held. He rarely broke into commentary during proceedings, much less with overt recognition, and yet, his voice, low and even, filled the room with finality. "Representative Crockett," he said, pausing deliberately, "is correct. Her points are well-founded, and every word deserves this body's respect." Stunned silence. For an instant, the entire chamber inhaled sharply in disbelief. Gasps punctuated the quiet. Reporters' heads whipped up, pens halting mid-page. Staffers in the back nearly dropped their binders. Even Crockett's most seasoned allies blinked in wide-eyed shock. Her antagonists, those same figures who had relished their sneers, froze as their strategy vaporized before their eyes. Robert's validation in the earlier outline had stunned Congress, but here it was, Judge Leon, the embodiment of judicial restraint, lending Crockett legitimacy that even her rivals dared not undercut. His words stole their smirks, stripped their chuckles, and left their reputations briefly undone. And through it all, Crockett herself remained rooted, her posture unchanged. The validation was not a surprise to her heart. She didn't gloat, didn't grin, didn't punch the air. She merely allowed the weight of his words to stand on their own, layered atop the dignity she had already claimed for herself. The moment did not redefine her. It revealed what she carried all along. The chamber no longer belonged to mockery. It belonged to her, to a leader who had turned every insult into fuel, every interruption into a setup, every stereotype into a shattered weapon. And with Judge Leon's astonishment voiced aloud, that power crystallized permanently before everyone present. What followed was silence again, but silence of a different kind. Not awkward, not derisive. It was silence born of reverence, the silence of truth acknowledged in real time. Every camera captured it, every phone screen hummed with it. Every person present knew they'd witnessed a rupture, the moment arrogance fractured against dignity, and dignity did not yield. Yet the moment didn't stay confined to those four walls. It was about to erupt across the nation. The sound of Judge Richard Leon's words hadn't even finished echoing across the chamber before the outside world began to roar. Within seconds of the clip hitting live streams, phones buzzed with alerts, notifications stacked like falling bricks, and timelines lit up with disbelief. For millions of viewers tuned in across the country, the moment felt surreal. Jasmine Crockett had not only held her ground in the lion's den, but the very judge presiding had broken his stoic silence to validate her. That's all it took. The internet detonated. Crockett was right trended faster than most breaking news stories, vaulting into the top slot on Twitter within 10 minutes of Leon's remark. Screenshots and GIFs of the judge leaning forward were paired with captions like, "The room stopped." "Breathing and respect served cold." Within an hour, another tag had joined it. "We respect moves." What began as commentary quickly turned into a digital chant, with ordinary people across the nation reposting the clip alongside their own words of celebration. On TikTok, the creativity was instantaneous. One video slowed the moment down into cinematic replay. Crockett's eyes steady, Leon leaning forward, then those words of affirmation. Set to thunderclaps and swelling violins. Another creator spliced the exchange over a beat drop, with text flashing "Dignity 1, Mockery 0. A popular remix looped her last piercing line, "I don't play caricatures," layered with Leon's solemn reply, as if it were dialogue out of a blockbuster film. The clip spawned reaction videos by the thousands, teens gasping, young professionals pausing midday to yell "yes," and lawyers shaking their heads with pride. One TikTok stitched Crockett's composure with messages from Black women across professions, teachers, doctors, activists, all saying in unison, "We needed this, we saw it, we felt it." YouTube reactors piled on as well. Political commentary channels replayed the exchange frame by frame, marveling at the unlikeliness of Judge Leon's intervention. Lifestyle vloggers and gamers, often far removed from political discourse, broke from regular uploads to watch the clip, their faces wide with shock, laughter, and awe. The word "historic" stamped itself across thumbnails overnight. Then came the public voices no one could ignore: celebrities, public intellectuals, and cultural icons. One Grammy-winning musician tweeted simply, "Say her name, Jasmine Crockett. That's composure as revolution." An Oscar-nominated actor followed. If you've ever doubted dignity could silence arrogance, watch this clip. This is history. Retweets cascaded as even athletes joined in. Before tip-off, a basketball star posted the moment to his feed, captioning it, "Balling with this same energy tonight." Meanwhile, news media scrambled. Networks scrapped their planned segments to feature the clip. Morning shows replayed Judge Leon's voice, marveling at his breaking of judicial decorum. The View devoted an entire segment to Crockett, their panelists laughing off her detractors' mockery and hailing her poise. Podcasts hurried to release emergency episodes, with one commentator calling the hearing the first time in years arrogance lost control on camera. And still, through the whirl of celebration, her opponents scrambled. They tried frantic spin control, firing out statements that Leon's words had been merely procedural, a nod of politeness. But the world had seen the footage. The body language was undeniable. No talking point could erase the look on his face or the reverence in his tone. Their arguments were drowned under waves of memes, edits, and declarations of solidarity. Perhaps most telling was the grassroots surge. Within days, shirts were printed with Leon's words, "Representative Crockett is correct." Posters with Crockett's defiant poise dotted protest marches, emblazoned with the hashtags that had grown into banners. College students made TikTok challenges repeating her lines. Community organizers echoed her phrases in rallies, chanting, "Who was right? Crockett was right." The chants echoed high above courthouse steps in cities across the country. For many who had lived with quiet indignities, the viral moment was more than entertainment. It was healing. Black women wrote personal essays on Medium and Substack about how validating it felt just to see a powerful man publicly affirm someone like them. Young professionals cited the clip as their new pep talk before entering workplaces where they were underestimated. For immigrant families watching, Crockett was proof their children's voices could someday cut through the static of derision and be recognized as truth. It was, in every sense, a digital earthquake. What began as an attempt to embarrass had become a cultural anthem. Crockett's fire, once boxed in by sneers and dismissals, had been set free across platforms, amplified by millions. But as potent as the memes, the hashtags, and the celebrity endorsements were, the true resonance went deeper, far deeper. Because what this moment represented was not just celebration over a clapback, not just another internet trend destined to fade within the week. But beneath the viral noise lay something even deeper, a redefinition of who belongs in America's highest chambers. In the end, what lingered wasn't the jeers, the laughter, or the smug grins that had filled the chamber at the start. What endured was dignity, a dignity that pierced through noise, stood unshaken before arrogance, and changed the tone of the entire room. Jasmine Crockett's strength that evening was not defined simply by her words, but by the way she embodied composure under fire. She proved something timeless, that real power depends not on volume, but on steadiness, not on interruption, but on clarity. Her resilience carried the weight of more than just the exchange in that moment. It carried years of stereotypes crafted to confine, years of assumptions about who deserves to be heard and who does not. Crockett knew the trap, saw it unfolding in real time, and refused to play her part. She gave the world something more revolutionary. She remained herself, a woman who would not bend to mockery, who turned derision back on its wielders by treating it as beneath her. And then came Judge Leon's validation. That subtle but unmistakable act shattered the illusion that condescension ruled unchallenged in those halls. It showed that allies, even unlikely ones, matter when the stakes are not about policy disputes, but about dignity itself. He didn't grandstand. He didn't dominate. He simply leaned forward and affirmed what everyone had seen but many were too comfortable to voice, that Crockett was right, and his recognition provided an essential lesson for this era. When truth is under attack, silence is complicity. Even subtle affirmation in the right moment can flip the entire narrative. Together, Crockett and Leon created something larger than either of them alone, a disruption of the cynical script the antagonists had written. She had proved the supremacy of dignity over noise. He had proved that acknowledgement from unexpected quarters can amplify that dignity into permanence. In those few minutes, justice stopped feeling abstract. It became visible, audible, undeniable. And for us, sitting outside that chamber, the lesson is clear too. We live in a society obsessed with spectacle, where arrogance often takes the spotlight and truth struggles for attention. Yet Crockett reminded us that resilience, calm, unyielding, unflinching, has the power to command any stage. We live in communities and workplaces where voices are regularly talked over or dismissed. Yet Leon reminded us that showing up, even briefly, to validate courage can echo louder than the negativity meant to erase it. This moment is not one to be filed away as political history. It is a reminder of American values at their best: belonging, justice, and resilience. In the face of cynicism, Crockett, standing tall in that chamber, affirmed that identity is not a liability but a strength, that refusing to contort yourself into someone else's caricature is itself an act of justice. Leon's nod affirmed that institutions can choose to recognize dignity where arrogance had tried to smother it. And together, those truths remind us that America is at its most American when it protects space for all voices, not just the loudest ones. So, if you've ever felt unseen in a room full of noise, this was your vindication. If you've endured side glances, dismissive tones, or deliberate interruptions meant to shrink you, Crockett's fire and composure proved your worth is not defined by their derision. If you've ever wished someone, anyone, would step in and simply say, "You're right," Judge Leon modeled what that courage looks like. This is why the moment rose above a courtroom clash. It was about planting a flag, a line in the Pomais, sand where dignity stood taller than mockery, where solidarity punctured cynicism, and where identity and truth were not liabilities but proof of belonging. When the chamber froze into silence, America glimpsed something rare: the possibility that justice is not just written in law, but acted out when dignity refuses to break and when others find the courage to affirm it. That silence wasn't empty, was filled with hope, with recognition, with respect. And that is the resonance Crockett left behind. Dignity will disrupt noise every time. She spoke, she commanded respect. And in that moment, she froze the room. That's what will be remembered long after the headlines fade, not the smirks, not the interruptions, not the sneers, but the sight of a woman standing firm in her truth, and the silence that followed when even Judge Richard Leon could not help but acknowledge it. This was never a debate. It wasn't a courtroom skirmish of back-and-forth points. It was a declaration of belonging, of dignity, of the undeniable power that comes when courage refuses to bow and composure writes its own verdict. And here's the truth. That declaration didn't just belong to Jasmine Crockett. It belongs to everyone who has ever been underestimated and everyone who has ever needed their voice affirmed. The lesson is carved clearly. Be like Jasmine. Unapologetic, centered, unbreakable in the face of mockery. And be like Leon. When you witness dignity rising in the middle of noise, don't sit silent. Validate it. Say it out loud. Because what you affirm may become the spark for others to finally be seen. If this moment left you inspired, then share it. Spread the story. Give it oxygen because dignity deserves to echo farther than mockery ever could. Tap like, hit subscribe. Add your voice to the growing movement of people who believe silence is no longer an option when truth sits before us. And in the comments, tell us, whose voice do you believe deserves validation next, because this isn't the end. The battle to honor dignity continues every day across every arena. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happened when someone clapped back at Ted Cruz. That moment is coming, and it's explosive.